This is Chris Rufo, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Yeah, this is going to be cool. Hey, Will Riley's with us too. Will, introduce our guest and why are we talking to him?
Yeah, so Pete, good to be back on the show. As you mentioned, Will Reilly, associate professor at KSU, pretty frequent guest. I wrote Taboo and Hate Crime Hoax, and we're talking to Chris Rufo as one of the best known guys in a particular field you could call anti-wokeness or responding to some of the extremes of critical theory. We spoke recently, Pete, obviously, to James Lindsay. And Chris was the other individual that was kind of recommended by that pretty sizable Twitter audience for both of us by this point. So glad to have you on the show, Chris.
It's great to be with you.
Yeah, I like having these conversations because Chris and I were just talking about some of his other work and then how that intersects with my work overseas and everything. And these cross-cultural problems where people start to project things onto other people, like assigning me a racist card or assigning me some kind of systematic membership into a community of hate. And I just don't understand that stuff in terms of how do you break out of that? Like if I can't even say, hey, no, really, I'm a good person without being told that, no, I'm not. How do you grow from that point? Chris, what do you think? Like, is it ever fair to assign someone something as hateful as racism?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it is, right? I mean, certainly there are people, especially, further you go into the past, that were racist and should be condemned as such. But the problem is that we've lowered the bar to the point where I've seen articles that are saying square dancing is racist, math is racist, logic is racist. I mean, showing up on time is racist. I mean, all of these things where the bar gets lowered to such an extent that the assumption of the anti-racists becomes racist. When you say stuff like showing up on time, objectivity, seeking comfort are elements of white supremacy, which is a common argument now. You're really the kind of implicit assumption is that people of color, Asians or Pakistanis or Latinos or South Americans are not oriented towards or perhaps not even capable of those values. And it gets to this kind of through the looking glass moment where everything becomes flipped. And I think that's what's really dangerous about the rhetoric now. And I think also in a weird way, so much talk about white supremacy, internalized oppression, et cetera, actually enables real white supremacists. There still are white supremacists in the United States, but they're a very small group of people. And unfortunately, they feed on all of this media frenzy. The media elevates actual white supremacists while trying to denigrate the majority of Americans as having internalized white supremacy.
Yeah, I think that's very much the dynamic you see on, for example, 4chan or Reddit. There are a lot of just young men that are, trash posting while they're at work. And there are a lot of jokes, a lot of memes. But you also see people that I more than occasionally suspect are actual Nazis, or at least American Renaissance types. There aren't many Nazis left, but exploiting that, just sort of building up on the anger, saying, well, if they say this, what else might they say? Don't you recognize that one thing unites us? Whiteness. And the reality is that if you asked 95% of the people on Reddit or even one of the Chans if they were an actual racist, the answer would be no. My girlfriend is African American or Japanese, which is actually a running joke in those forums. But if you insist, and by you I mean sort of the activist left, if you insist on labeling a whole range of normal behavior racist and pathological, actual racists are going to have that path in, saying, well, they're putting us all together. Don't you understand who your real allies are? I think definitely that is a risk. Kind of opening with a question, essentially. When you talk about some of we've used phrases so far, woke, critical, so on down the line, critical theory. When you talk about this, how would you define what your opposition is? What is critical theory to you, or what is wokeness to you, as opposed to a broad phrase like social justice? What does that mean empirically?
Yeah, I guess it's like a spectrum, right? On the kind of social justice left, it tends, the harder left it gets, the more that it is kind of critical theory based rather than civil rights based. And the distinction there, I think, is an important one, because the civil rights movement, and this is something that I found fascinating, the civil rights movement, at least as I interpret the history, emerges from two traditions. It emerges from Christianity. A huge proportion of the folks in the civil rights movement were based both kind of philosophically but also organizationally from the black churches. And then it's also emerges from, I think, calling Americans to the best values of the Declaration and the Constitution. So, people who had actually said, we're not living up to our own values as a country. So that was a kind of fusion that then became politically activated that was a really unstoppable force in retrospect. Critical theory, though, on the kind of further side, it really is not drawn from any of those kind of organic American social institutions. It's drawn from a kind of radical atheism, where it denies the kind of importance of faith. It also denies the kind of faith idea that that in the afterlife, you will be rewarded. They're saying, no, we can't have radical transcendence. We need to have radical immanence. So we need to actually create social justice here on earth. It's a kind of Marxist twist. And then it's also based in kind of European and German philosophy of Marxism and then critical theory, and the kind of Frankfurt School, that also explicitly rejects the ideas of the American Constitution. So it rejects colorblindness, it rejects individual rights, it rejects private property. So what you have is a kind of radical movement that I think unfortunately has taken the mantle of civil rights, saying we are the new civil rights movement. But if you actually peek under the hood at the ideology, the lineage of these things could not be more separate, could not be more different.
Yeah, just one sentence before Pete's question. I mean, in political science, the way this is often distinguished is that the traditional civil rights movement was an attempt to move, say, blacks. Before that, you could argue Irish Americans, even women, certainly into the mainstream of American life. The critical perspective has generally been that the mainstream of American life is itself extremely flawed. So you don't want to give African Americans an equal chance to become police officers. You might want to get rid of all the police officers because they are enforcing the will of the propertied class and so on. So yeah, essentially agree on the distinction. Pedro, a question?
Well, I don't know if Chris wanted to say anything after that. I'll give him space first.
Well, what you're saying, Will, reminds me, I think one of the folks I saw on Twitter last week, it was maybe earlier this week, I can't really remember, made the list of the kind of black scholars that he said, these are the integrated scholars, and you were on the list. And it's like, so now, like, in the assumption is weird, right? It's saying, and the assumption, he obviously said, I disagree with these folks. These folks are kind of categorically on the bad side. But it's like we're saying that integration is now a sign, as kind of a flaw, is a sign of something bad. It's really strange how the language has kind of changed so rapidly. And I think it's, like you're saying, it's not bringing kind of minority groups into the mainstream, right? It's not bringing Catholics and Italians and Chinese Americans and African Americans into the kind of main culture. They're saying the dominant culture is irredeemably evil and must be overthrown. It's not a kind of integration movement, it's a revolutionary movement. I think it's a big difference, and we have to be kind of aware of the full kind of scope and the full potential for that way of thinking.
Yeah, I actually, just as a quick comment on that, I saw that list. Ironically, that's from a guy, Rod Graham, who follows me on Twitter and who you and I have both sparred with online. I don't think he intended that to go that viral. But I mean, it was picked up by Titania McGrath and these sort of people. So by the end of that whole thing, I mean, I have 20,000+ social media followers just on Twitter now, a lot more scattered across Facebook pages and so on. So, 100K, good work. But I mean, basically, the argument there was that Black people who use logic to argue against the idea of systemic racism. One of the things I've notably pointed out in presentations and the like is that the income gap between blacks and whites, which is probably the primary argument for systemic racism, essentially goes away if you adjust for 3 or 4 things: age, modal age for Black Americans is 27. For whites, it's 58. That is the mode, not the median. But I mean, region, people make across races much less in the South because of where the boats landed. Without being glib, many African Americans are concentrated in the South. And test scores, if you make those simple adjustments, the gap closes to about 1 or 2%. With adjustments for different variables, that's also what you see with men and women. The actual gender wage gap is about 3%. So I've made this point, and I think Rod's argument was that I'm only able to make that point rather than feeling a sense of passion and anger or something like this, because I've had an easy life, perhaps because I'm a light-skinned African-American guy, so on. What's ironic about this is I actually grew up in a single-family home in the hood. There are a lot of broke white and Hispanic people. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I was born on the south side of Chicago, grew up on the east side of Aurora. But I mean, the majority of my friends living in the hood were of Hispanic or Eastern European descent, and weren't treated, noticeably more kindly by the police than my Black buddies. So that whole thing, there's actually a hilarious conversation about the intersections between class and race and so on there. And I would wonder how many of the people accusing me of being rich and pampered are themselves from, upper class 2-parent families in the suburb. So all this conversation went on in the comments under that. But yeah, the argument that integration is itself, a risky, bizarre thing, college housing should be segregated. We are seeing that again. That's actually a question I wanted to ask down the road.
That sounds like we're going backwards, by the way. I mean, when Martin Luther King says, judge on character, not the color of the skin, we're getting rid of segregation. Is this just a problem of people who aren't well read enough to understand that, look, we just don't know enough about anything to speak definitively about anything. And if you mind your own damn business and work on improving your own life, you're probably going to do better over time.
No, these are paradoxically some of the, at least in a kind of credential way, the best educated people in the country. And I think my read of it, and this really kind of builds on what Will was saying, is that critical race theory is an ideology that serves to kind of secure and burnish the social status of elites of all races, right? So you get someone who's posing as the kind of woke revolutionary who is a tenured professor at an Ivy League college, or getting a $10 million contribution from Twitter or a large corporation, or, Robin DiAngelo, kind of white woman from Seattle, University of Washington professor giving the $20,000 per hour speeches. So it does, if you are a person of any race, critical race theory is great for business, for kind of academic and intellectual elites. But if you actually look, and I spent 5 years, like the reason I can speak on this with some authority is that I spent 5 years directing a film for PBS about life in 3 of America's poorest cities. A predominantly white working class city in Youngstown, Ohio, a predominantly Black urban environment in Memphis, Tennessee, and then a Latino and multiracial neighborhood in Stockton, California. And critical race theory in particular, has nothing to offer people in those communities. Nothing. In fact, it's actually a step worse. It would seek to degrade and ultimately destroy the institutions, the values, the virtues, and the habits that actually give people from those environments a way to move up. And, the concerns, and even on a basis of just concern, if you want to say, well, let's not look at it kind of causally, what can happen. But if you talk to people, I talked to thousands of people, interviewed thousands of people in these places, there is no overlap between the concerns of critical race theorists and the concerns of America's poorest people of all racial backgrounds. None. The things that people are talking about on the south side of Memphis don't even touch the things that people are talking about in the faculty lounge at Yale. I mean, it couldn't be more disconnected. So I think, to me, that's really the crime of the ideology, is that it uses the kind of imagery and authenticity and kind of rhetorical value of the disenfranchised, the marginalized, the poor, and then uses it to burnish their own status, their own economic fortune, their own success in life. And I think that, I won't stand for it. And I think we should be very, very clear in what it is, what it isn't, and what value it has.
So, I mean, are you saying, and I definitely agree with what you're saying because of my own work and everything, and seeing what actual struggle looks like from people. But are you saying that the poor folks in the three different places, they overlap in their own little mini Venn, but then the critical race theory is completely outside of that? It's like I like to bring in Euler diagrams whenever I can. It's an Euler diagram, but they're not even in the big box. They're outside of it. I mean, I've been poor. I still don't make very much money, but when you're poor, there's always a poor tax. You have to go to court. It's $500. Now you got to set up a payment plan. I drove around my car unregistered for years because I had a $1,200 problem. That was just a money problem. That wasn't, I wasn't a criminal, but I was being made a criminal, and nearly had my car towed into an impound yard, which would have meant I had no car anymore. You know, all of these things are much more important to me as someone who doesn't have enough money to solve minor problems.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a whole thing. There's like what I learned in Stockton. I think of it as like the gauntlet, where you talk to guys. Hey, what are the challenges that you're facing? He says, well, Monday I have to show up to my probation officer. Tuesday I have to do court-mandated anger management. Wednesday I got to go try to get my license back. Thursday I got to go to the. It's like you actually kind of break it down to the actual tangible. What are the challenges in front of you? And it's very, no one's like, bro, like the systemic racism has got me down. And it could be, maybe there's an argument. So, they may say, well, it's because people who are disenfranchised from education can't recognize systemic racism. And I would be the first person to say, hey, there are certain things that have racially disproportionate effects. There are probably things at the margins that are have racially discriminatory outcomes. But the things that, for example, the people I talk to most, it's saying it's family. People says, oh man, my family is going through a hard time. I don't know my father. I want my kids to have a better life than I did. It's work opportunities. People trying to fight to be able to get an opportunity to have meaningful employment, kind of dignified wage, and a whole host of other things. And I think that if you look at the very abstract language of the critical race theorists, it's any problem can be kind of reduced to systemic racism, which we're not going to explain. We're not going to break it out into component parts. We're not going to really be rigorous about it in a kind of statistical way. You just have to believe us, because it's this great ghost that is haunting the country. And every evil, every misfortune can be kind of attributed to it. And it just doesn't seem to be a very rigorous way of thinking about things. And it doesn't seem to be a way of thinking about things that actually has a tangible relationship to people's everyday struggles.
Just to play devil's advocate here, wouldn't the sort of, not even CRT, but just critical or academic response be that a fair amount of the things that you would encounter in Stockton, California, or in South Memphis are the result of certainly social class, even of racism in the past? I mean, when people talk about police abuse, I mean, I was a poor man. It's simply a fact that you are more likely to be harassed by the cops as a poor man than you are as, an upper middle class older citizen. So don't some of those things, wouldn't people even in Stockton argue that some of those things tie into their class status or their race?
Yeah, totally. I think all those things you said are accurate. I would agree 100%. And so kind of taking them piece by piece, I think they would. But what you also see, though, and I think the distinction between class and race is really important there. Because like Stockton, right? The great example, gang life in Stockton is organized not by race, but by geography. Right. This is actually pretty unique in American cities, where typically you have gangs, and certainly in even California prisons, you have gangs that are separated by race. Although there are gangs in California prisons now, there are the others, where you go if you're kind of not easily categorizable. But in Stockton, it's really block by block. And gangs, I spent 3.5 years with members of one gang that is multiracial. There's a Native American guy, a Hmong kind of Southeast Asian guy. There's some white guys. There's black guys. I mean, it truly is like the United Nations, but it's just a criminal street gang in Stockton. The police are going to beat up on those guys the same way. They will get equally treated poorly sometimes. But I think that it's reducible not to race, right? Even on the surface, you can say, well, if they're going after these guys, it can't be race. But I think it is definitely class. And if you look at the circumstances of these individuals who I got to know really well, it's a tragic class story. And what unites them is not race, it's actually their class kind of upbringing, class orientation, class opportunities, class discrimination. So I think that what I found is that the more salient variable is class. It's an economic and cultural issue. Some race, certainly. Like Memphis is different than Youngstown, right? So the black community in Memphis has a different set of challenges, different set of historical experiences, and kind of historical discrimination, historical racism than the kind of white working class or formerly working class in Youngstown. But I think there's more commonality, a more kind of important variable is class, and yet the New York Times doesn't want to talk about class. Nobody wants to talk about class. It's kind of like this thing that is lurking, that is invisible, that is shaping people's lives, but is uncomfortable to talk about. Because if you want to talk about class, it's very hard to maintain the kind of tenets of critical theory. They go actually against each other. It's also kind of embarrassing for a lot of people, especially affluent, highly educated people, to talk about class. That's still true. And then third, I think this is really important. If you talk about woke corporations or woke capital, they're very happy to talk about racism. They're very happy to talk about culture. They're very happy to talk about gender ideology. Those things are great. Those are nice things that they can support over time because they don't threaten the economic interests that is their ultimate concern. Culture, kind of woke culture, is a distraction from kind of potentially like woke communism, or woke socialism, or woke taxes, or woke class warfare. And I think it plays into a kind of ease of rhetoric, right? No one in Seattle or New York or San Francisco is going to get in trouble for sponsoring a pride parade or putting up a Black Lives Matter banner on their Instagram. But if they were advocating for corporate taxes, et cetera, it might not go over as well.
This stuff is exasperating. One of the things, whenever I have these engagements with people, and look, as a middle-aged white dude who's reasonably calm when he gets pulled over and try to be nice and let the officer know, hey, you're no threat here, you're going to go home safe. I get treated pretty well overall because I'm starting to, I respect the fact that cop wants to go home that night, and I ensure that they know that's going to happen. I would submit that no matter what color your skin is, if you're middle-aged and you took that tack with an officer and didn't start with pissed off, you've got an opportunity. You can still get pissed off later, but you've got an opportunity to get out of that regardless of the color of your skin. Even worse, one of the things where these things tend to break down is, and I say this a lot on the show, but it remains true, and that's why I keep saying it. Basically, anybody in this nation can go and poop into potable water. It's incredible how fortunate we are in a lot of the world. Freshwater, okay, great, but also you don't have to think about that poop again. It disappears and it gets processed, and that is even more rare. That complete chain. We're also wonderfully, wonderfully lucky to live in this place where their stability is relatively a norm. I mean, this is not Iraq. This is not Baghdad. It's just not. I mean, you name a place that's crazy. It's not Syria. Where people have to leave their lives just to survive. They don't want to leave. That's our home, but. What is it about? And I granted these the critical race theory people are well educated. Here's what I know about well educated folks: they oftentimes end up in an ivory tower with no fucking reality as to what goes on the ground, and it pisses me off because I guarantee you that Kindy dude has to be to meetings on time, and his boss will get mad at him if he doesn't do his file his reports and do all his admin stuff, all that white stuff.
I don't know if you're up on how woke college is now at a historically black college. You'd get in serious trouble for that. But I bet if Ibram Kendi showed up an hour late for a meeting with a woke white boss, there'd be a long discussion about how that was understandable and just so wonderful, and people have different approaches. Just wanted to jump in with that. It's an interesting world.
They would, it would be incumbent upon the white boss to understand the kind of cultural context of showing up late, and I mean, you can smart people are very able to kind of rationalize almost anything. So whatever the social incentives are within the institution, you can rationalize your way around anything. That's what James Lindsay does on Twitter all day. I mean, James Lindsay will take some absurd woke belief and rationalize it in a kind of mocking way. But I don't know. I think there's two things here to your point about class, poverty in the United States, etc. On one hand, economically, someone in the lowest quintile in the United States, so at that 20% mark, so poorer than 80% of other people. This is someone that is poor. That kind of bottom fifth, that bottom quintile, is equivalent to the middle income or middle class wage in many poor European countries, right? So the United States is significantly more wealthy than many poor European countries like Italy or Spain or Greece, etc. So on one hand, you say, well, this is great. So we have people who are in America are poor, are actually kind of could be on a kind of dollar by dollar basis, actually have the purchasing power of someone in the European middle class. So you could say, poor people in America actually have a relatively high standard of living. But there's a twist, there's a wrinkle, there's a kind of contradiction, there's a paradox there that actually, my father is from a very poor village in Italy, and I grew up going back to the village in the summer times and spending a lot of time with my relatives, etc. This village is by American standards, the average wage would be in the lowest 20%. It'd be very, very poor. But it has a kind of functioning social fabric and high functioning social institutions where kids can go out and play on their own. People, even though, my grandfather went to 5th grade and some of my cousins don't graduate from high school, they're oriented with kind of very structured families, very structured work routines. Even people who are kind of farmers, there's kind of a rhythm and a respect for that kind of work. And the community itself is very vibrant. It has kind of, it's a poor little town, but then they'll have operas in the summer. I mean, that kind of thing. And would I rather be, double the income living on the south side of Chicago or the south side of Memphis or the south side of Stockton? Or would I rather be half the income living in the small village in Italy? It's a very easy choice because you have a kind of now a disconnection between economy and society in the United States, where you can grow up on the south side of Stockton. It's a brutal, violent, very difficult place to grow up. You have certain neighborhoods where it's virtually 100% of families are single parent families, which is a huge burden. And so you're entering this kind of strange world where we have, everyone in Stockton has kind of potable water and indoor plumbing and television and cars and etc. But there's something crucial that has actually been lost. And I would argue that is actually worse now in some regards than it was 50 years ago. And that's something that I think we have to grapple with and be very honest with. And as I'm a conservative, right? I'll just, get out there and say it. But even as conservatives, the kind of bootstrap rhetoric is not enough. The kind of, there's economic opportunity rhetoric is not enough. The kind of rhetoric that you hear from conservatives that is kind of Reagan-era hangover is not enough because there are very real challenges. Discrimination, racism is among them. But there are very real challenges in the United States. And I think we, on the left, they at least rhetorically take them seriously. Their solutions, I don't think, are the right ones, but they at least care. And I think conservatives need to do a much better job at actually engaging, understanding, and kind of experiencing, kind of in a more direct way, what's happening in many communities in the United States.
Yeah, that's a good point. Kind of a quick follow up and then a question. I think Pete has a question after that. But I mean, so when you talk about the idea of systemic racism, it's always struck me, and I've talked about this with John McWhorter and some other people, that people really use that term interchangeably to mean three different things. It's probably most often used to refer to contemporary racism today that allegedly prevents Black people from succeeding. And if you actually unpack that, like the claim that there are a very large number of African Americans killed by police in a typical year, that often turns out to be fallacious. That turns out to be pretty hard to sustain. There are two other meanings that I see, though, that do have some validity. The second meaning, which you hear sometimes, is past racism or past conflict and almost warfare between the races in the USA resulted in conditions like the higher percentage of substandard slum housing in black neighborhoods, poor white neighborhoods as well, by the way, that you definitely see. African Americans aren't choosing to live in more rundown communities. So that's the second definition. Past history, especially in the case of blacks, caused these problems. The third definition, which you would hear from a McWhorter or a Shelby Steele, is that sort of an oppositional culture developed in response to white racism during the period of ethnic conflict, so that you have a 72% illegitimacy rate in black communities. And by this point, I think you're getting away from kind of any useful meaning of the term racism, but I've heard all three of those. And as you said, those kind of interplay with class. So the question I would ask when you talk about reasonable conservative solutions, what would those be? Like, I tend to see the effect of racism in the past as very simply just being that more brothers are poor today. There are more African Americans in the lower working class than there are whites, proportionately. But what would you do about that when you say we need to get away from these leftist solutions, like, you know, focusing on systemic racism may not be real? What's your solution, the Rufo solution?
Well, it's complex. So yeah, first I'll kind of take the kind of tripartite idea that you've had of systemic racism. The first one, I think we both agree, is probably not a lot of kind of rigor to it, or not a lot of validity to it. The second one is undoubtedly true, right? If you're talking about the legacy of historical systemic racism. I mean, Jim Crow is systemic racism. There's no doubt about that. Those are laws that are in place that are designed both as kind of an intention and also as an impact to discriminate against a group of people based on race. I mean, that's as clear of a definition of systemic racism. It's also not that long ago. I remember I directed a film, totally separate topic. It was about athletes up to 100 years old that compete in Olympic sports. And two of the guys that I spent time kind of following were these championship swimmers in Washington, D.C., African-American guys. One was 94, one was 92. And one of the guys said something that just shocked me and really kind of gave me a kind of very kind of deep sense of how little time has passed in kind of American history. He said, you know, Chris, I attended the inauguration event of Barack Obama in 2008 on the Washington Mall, and it was a really meaningful moment to me because I also remember when I was 5 years old, my grandmother used to live in the house with me, and my grandmother couldn't read. And I remember thinking, when I get a little older, I want to teach my grandmother how to read. And, you know, she couldn't read because she was a freed slave. So this is a guy who has seen in his own lifetime, kind of sitting with his grandmother as a small child who was freed from slavery, to then attending the inauguration of America's first black president. And you could say that doesn't change systemic factors. There might be an argument there, but it's not that long ago. So I think there's a lot of validity to that. You look at the community in Memphis, you can kind of see, even in the kind of structures and locations and geographies and housing and institutions, how there is a legacy of racism, systemic racism. 100%. You look at I spent a lot of time in a public housing project in Memphis, and I mean, it's people are set up for failure by public policy. What would a solution look like? That's $1 million question, right? I think two things. One is, in my view, you have to do two things. One, you have to actually, and this is again now kind of an issue that spans across race, where you have comparable-ish, if you factor in for class, comparable rates of single-parent families, for example. We have to get more serious about some of the cultural issues. So you look at family structure. I think we need to really kind of bolster, especially faith institutions in poor communities of all races, I think are really critical. But I think from a kind of public policy point of view, people want hard policy solutions. What I think has to be done is that you have to take the enormous amount of means-tested anti-poverty spending. It's now about $1.1 trillion per year in the United States. This is a huge sum. Most of it's to Medicaid, but even after you factor out kind of medical expenses, this is a massive kind of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in support. But what the problem is that it's administered and largely kind of siphoned off by the bureaucracy. And I think what would do a tremendous amount of good is is taking the kind of centralized command and control programs that are run from brutalist architecture buildings in Washington, D.C., and the kind of everyone takes their cut as it reaches down to a place like Memphis or Stockton or Youngstown, and actually redistribute it into the form of a negative income tax, in form of a wage supplement. Because I think you'd see very quickly whereas if someone is saying in the south side of Stockton, says, oh man, I'm not going to get a job, they'll pay me $12 an hour, it's not worth it. But if all of a sudden you transform that into a $18, $20, $21 an hour job, I think you'd see incentives shift. You'd see people, you'd take kind of entry level, kind of minimum wage, you'd turn it into a kind of middle or dignified wage. I think that would shift a lot of the incentives as both a positive, but also get rid of a lot of the negatives. You talked about how the bureaucracy kind of runs people's lives. We talked about it. They have to show up to all these things. Most of that could be really kind of dispatched. Most of that, I think, is pernicious. I think it's well-intentioned, but the actual outcomes are actually very bad for people. And if you look at like public housing in places where it's like the intention is good, they built these public housing units in the kind of earliest examples in the 30s and 40s as a kind of worker housing. As people were migrating across the country, there was a lot of kind of displacement and migration for opportunity. But I think we know now doesn't actually work. Why don't you take that money and actually give it to people? And I think the more you could decentralize power, the more you could give people money and trust them, because the most kind of insulting part of the welfare state as we know it, or the kind of bureaucratic or social scientific state, is that it's deeply patronizing. It's saying, I'm going to make the decisions, I'm going to manage the money, you're going to do X, Y, and Z because I've determined through my spreadsheet analysis that that's what's best for you. Give people money. Tie it to work, tie it to wages, tie it to income, tie it to kind of the discipline of the market. But give people money and trust that they'll do the best thing with their lives. And I've seen it. I've seen it in a lot of these places where when you empower people, you trust people, they're actually going to surprise you by doing the right thing. And I think that the left, in a kind of paradoxical way, is actually very patronizing and very untrusting of the lower class. They want to manage lower class life, not empower lower class people. And I think that's a huge distinction and a huge opportunity for change.
I wanted to bring up a point a few minutes ago. You talked about, like, I'll admit it, I'm a conservative. And this is part of this overall narrative, like where you have to hide that in some way, be ashamed of it. You know, like I'm a centrist, and people will instantly say, no, you're not, you're whatever. It depends on who I'm talking to. But these conversations are like, we can't even, like, I want the best for people. I just put it on Twitter. Like my bias is I believe in people, like you do. Give someone, unencumber them, like someone who's, okay, look, here's how it works in court. This is for everybody who's not been in court in a long time. I'm a Turner, right? You talk about critical race theory. How about critical alphabetized theory? So I go to court on something. I'm just waiting to have my ass kicked by the judge because I'm going to have to pay more money than I've got in my account. But I have to wait because I'm a Turner. So first, all of the lawyers go through. And then the lawyers come back through again for the second part of their hearing. And then you go to anybody who needs an interpreter. Oh, wait, don't forget that one guy who's in lockdown. They're going to bring him in because he's in lockdown. They're trying to get him processed so he can either get back to jail or be on lockdown. Okay, and then we're going to start with the A's. Oh, by the way, here come the 9 o'clock appointments. Oh, well, let's get these lawyers in here first, too. And the next thing you know, I've sat in court all day just because I'm a Turner, right? So imagine if your name is Deontay Williams. You're going to go after me and you're going to lose at least 1 day of pay. And then if they're like, hey, you have to come back, you're like, fuck, God damn it. Like these are these inhibitors. Another thing I want to say about this is I did a whole series on the Prison Chronicles. And in terms of systematic failure of people, I mean, for sure, black men pay a high price in terms of prison. They are the grist that comes out of that prison industrial complex. And we chew them up and we all look down upon them because they haven't figured it out. And then in that community, when you talk to people like Devone Bogan, who runs a program, he goes to Stockton and he tries to deprogram and build these young men up with uncles. And it doesn't matter if they're black or whatever. He just finds the most dastardly people, the people that are doing the most violence, and he runs them through a program, which everybody hates. The right hates it. The left hates it. Everybody hates it. But what he produces are, tradesmen, people who start with, we had Honore Vachon, and he talked about his dark companion, this soul-sucking, life-sucking leech that lived on him while he was in the gangs, and it made him devalue life, his own life, his mirror's life, your life. He devalued life in general. There's no connection between critical race theory and solving these complex problems, because I can't continue to spend, by the way, while you go to court, if it doesn't get resolved, you go out, you still have to drive to work. So you still get pulled over and you still get another ticket, and you just in this perpetual cycle where you'll never get out of it. And it's literally a $500 or $1,000 problem. So these elements, access to cash, or like instead of bailing a bunch of people out for being assholes in the street and breaking people's property, why not go find someone and say, hey, what's your smallest money problem that you can't solve? Oh, you know what? I got 15 parking tickets and I just don't give a damn anymore. Like that. These are the things that hobble poor people, regardless of race. And when there is a racial element, when another guy from the Prison Chronicles said, prison is an extension of my community. That should not be a norm. Nobody in America wants that. How do we solve that with critical race theory? I don't think you can.
I feature a guy in my film, a guy named Mike Doherty, who's a white guy, but he's kind of more Latino cultural, like in the Latino culture. So some people think he's Latino, but he told me something that he said, oh man, like when I go back to jail, it's awesome because I get to see all my old friends.
Yes.
I mean, and it's like, and it's kind of tragic, and you almost laugh because there's some humor, dark humor to it. But yeah, I think that I think that, let's say broadly, progressives, I think, underestimate how much the state and the bureaucracy determines life for people at the bottom. I think it's really the key institution. It provides most of the actual income. It provides a large portion of the services. When people, get caught doing something bad, then it provides all of the kind of discipline and punishment. And I think it's a world that I have privilege, right? I definitely have privilege for a number of different kind of categories, right? I can avoid that process. But if you are growing up in a low-income neighborhood, you cannot avoid it. You cannot escape it. It's going to determine how you make decisions. And I think that it actually ends up perverting a lot of the decision-making process, where if you are a lawyer living in an affluent suburb, your decisions are going to be guided by a kind of middle-class logic. And if you are growing up in that environment, it's very difficult for you to understand the kind of lower class logic, let's call it, not in a pejorative sense. I don't view it that way at all, but there's a different set of logical mechanisms at work. There's a different set of incentives. And I think that that's a big part of the problem. And I think that when I meet people in those communities, I don't say, oh, you're making bad decisions. That's a kind of conservative relic idea. Well, the people made the bad decisions. They need to do this and that. And it's like, no, get actually on the ground, meet people, understand they're actually making logical decisions based on a broken system that has been set up. So I think if there's a really argument for systemic racism in the United States today, it's really that. It's really that the bureaucracy and the governing institutions that really dominate lower class life. Yeah. And because class and race have a kind of high intersection for minorities, it actually appears to be a race issue. Systemic racism is the kind of dysfunctional bureaucracy that has been designed by people who don't understand kind of the logic of life for people in the lower income bracket, and good intentions that have gone wrong, compounded by time and waste and policy and kind of ineptitude. I think there might be an argument there. I don't know. I haven't thought of it that way, but maybe systemic racism is real. Maybe it lives in a kind of unintentional policy formulation. I don't know.
I wanted to add on to that because
very quick. Wouldn't that be almost a purely class issue, though? I mean, I keep track of this as an African American gentleman. I mean, it's something like 49% of the people on welfare are white before you get into
more than that. Yeah, more than that. Yeah.
So it's pretty. There's a separation between white and Caucasian because of how the Hispanic category is counted. It's pretty proportional, though.
Yeah.
Poverty. A friend of mine, actually, I was doing a coaching job back in my old neighborhood a while back. And we were just the guys that we were coaching were just sitting around BSing, and someone was like, "You know what the most integrated U.S. institution is?" And I said, "I don't know." And it turned out to be the Army.
Yeah.
But second was jail. Like, I didn't believe this, and people were pulling it up on their phones. It was 50% white, 30% black, 20% Hispanic. So I think a lot of diverse, inclusive. So I think a lot of these really are class issues. One very quick note before Pete's question also, coming from a working class neighborhood, not the hyper ghetto by any means, but there is a lot of bad decision making. So I am, as an African American guy, especially speaking with young men, there's some things I'm just very traditionally right wing about. You can choose to wear a condom. They're given out for free in high school and college. You know, illegitimacy rate is getting up to 50% for Caucasians. It's 70% for us. Out of wedlock birth rate. I mean, it's not difficult to get a job in most communities. The percentage of young guys that are sort of hoppers in the gang scene that say, you know, I could get a job as a shift lead at McDonald's in a week is around 80% every time that's been done. So there is an element of personal choice there. I mean, people choose to sell crack, and it's a logical decision that you make more money pushing weight than you do working at McDonald's. But it's illogical in the sense that you're very, very likely going to be inside the county lockup in a year. So there certainly is a message there from older citizens, from older men especially. This is dumb. It's not always a logical response unless you're thinking with a 16-year-old boy's mind.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, I think, but in a sense, like, you know, where I grew up, it was really unthinkable. Like, I'm not going to go to jail. I don't know anyone that has gone to jail or prison. It was kind of. But if you, maybe in your experience is a little bit different, but I imagine that a lot of the people you knew growing up are similar to the people that I met in the last 5 years, where it's kind of a regular part of the society. It's kind of baked in because you know a cousin or an uncle or a neighbor. And I think that your point on the economics, right? And John McWhorter talks about this. I talked to him about this one time, and you know, the drug war, the drug trade is a very kind of lucrative payout. And I talked to a guy that was, you know, crack and a crack dealer a long time, and he said, yeah, you know, I can slang, I can put back 60 grand, and then I get locked up for maybe 9 months, and then I'm back. To me, that's worth it. It's an economic decision that's worthwhile. Right. But you need to build up an alternative. You can't just say, don't sell crack. Selling crack is bad. I mean, you should say that. I mean, that should be an important message. But you also have to say, and I have another opportunity for you. And, you know, I think, again, that kind of negative income tax idea is providing a wage supplement to working class jobs. So that service job at McDonald's, that kind of beginning forklift driver at the FedEx warehouse in Memphis near the airport is all of a sudden a job where maybe the economic incentives shift a little bit. And say, oh man, I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to get locked up. It's not worth it. If I put in 50 hours a week here and I get the wage supplement, I get overtime, you know, all of a sudden that's looking more attractive. I think we have to offer the positive alternative. Otherwise, you're just scolding and hectoring people and not understanding the world through their eyes. And I think that's a tremendously important thing to be able to do.
Yeah.
You're nailing this thing down. That's exactly right. There's a couple things to talk about. One, again, you know, these folks who have these super high powered degrees and they talk about critical race theory do not have my experience that boots on the ground. This is not NGO, like I'm out there helping people learn how to sew or that kind of thing. This is like I'm in the reality of the people that are here, and it in no way matches with what your theory is. So like this ground truth, what are you going to do today? How do you help someone put that next foot forward? And this is exactly what Devone does over at Advanced Peace. I mean, he identifies 25 dudes that are killing people, pimping hoes, selling drugs. These are the worst people the cops can identify. And then he's like, hey, come down to City Hall. I swear to God, we're not out to get you. I want to talk to you. I want to offer you something. Yeah. And then he puts on like, you know, a little name tent on like the big fancy oak table, and he sits him down. And instead of like, you know, corn pop, he's like, you know, Mr. Stevens, sorry, we have left you behind as a community. We're going to repair that. If you accept our offer, you know, open your it's a pitch. And then they run them through this entire program. And so whatever they're doing that's illicit, yes, they're going to still do it for a while because they've got to buy in. They've got to deprogram themselves. You know, they may have to go to anger management classes because why the fuck wouldn't they be angry? Why wouldn't they have a drug problem living where they live? And so as they work through this, you know, this program, And also, by the way, just to the city officials, yes, when you bring combative gang members into City Hall, sometimes a fight's going to break out. That is a KPI that you're actually doing the right thing. These guys are now in City Hall having a fight, as opposed to on the street having a fight. And then he'll literally sit them on an airplane and fly them to DC or somewhere, and their road dog is the guy that they hate on the street, and they slowly work them through this process, and then they turn these violent people, when they accept, into, again, tradesmen, or like, hey, I'd love to become a guy who trades stock. They'll go out and they'll find you a mentor, and they build this system. But this is impossible work. You have to build trust and all of these things. All anybody talks about in the news about this is they say, and they give them a stipend as they get to a certain level in the program, like, we need to get you some money. And all anybody ever writes about is paying criminals not to commit crime. And it's just wholly unfair for the work that they're doing, because the programming, the cultural. When I was in combat zones, I talked to a lot of dudes, and I would say, "What's next for you?" And they would laugh. They had no dreams. They had no future, because they only had today. And that's the same thing that these guys in these gangs in urban areas have. And so I often ask, when I have black folks who are like community people, I say, what does the black community owe itself? And it's a really hard question. They struggle with it because it's not an easy answer.
Yeah. I think a guy that is great, and you guys should consider having him on, is Robert Woodson at the Woodson Center.
Yeah, Bob's been on the show.
Oh, he's the best. And I was on a conference call with him yesterday, I think. And I think another thing too is like, I'm a son of an immigrant. I'm an Italian native speaker, citizen, so I have that kind of background. And I think the thing about critical race theory is that, to get kind of connect all the dots, is that it breaks us down into these really kind of abstract, but also very artificial kind of racial categories, right? Where all white people are the same, whether you are, which you could tell my dad that. He'd say, "Oh yeah, all white people are the same." He's like, "What? Like, Italians and Germans are not the same. Italians and Scandinavians are not the same. This is false. You can't say that. That's actually an insult." And I think people need to have kind of a celebratory sense of their history and heritage. And I think, groups and certainly African American history, there's like the 1619 Project maybe is not the exact representation, but it represents some part of the brutal reality of the history. But someone like Bob Woodson also, every time I talk to him, he has some celebratory, some empowering, some inspiring historical bit that I had never heard about. And is like, and is calling on people to say, hey, actually, we have resilience, we have success. He said, he told me yesterday, he said, maybe not get the exact number right. He said, 6 freed slaves died millionaires, something like that. I mean, and then you got to think, wow, who are these people? Who are these men? How did that happen? What was their story? And I think, even like whatever your ethnic background is, mine is Italian. I don't know the two of you, but you have to build up a sense of positive identity that is rooted in historical fact. Whereas I think critical race theory is a purely negative formulation. It pits people in this brutal world where they don't have history, they don't have ethnicity, they only have control over power and violence and oppression. Or you are the kind of oppressed, and that becomes your identity. And I think that a real rich sense of identity, right? An identity, not necessarily identity politics, but a sense of personal identity, is something that is much richer, much deeper, much more kind of historical, much more narrative, much more inspiring. And I think that is really like the antidote to a kind of world that is defined by critical race theory. Because in the end of the day, critical race theory is a pessimistic philosophy. It rejects the Constitution, it rejects principles of equality, it rejects colorblindness, it rejects the possibility of racial reconciliation, and it only imagines a world of kind of naked, kind of racial dominance and oppression and brutality. And I don't want to believe in that world. I want to believe in a world where success is possible for all groups, where there is a kind of historical identity for all different people of all different backgrounds that people can be proud of. There is a possibility for integration, racial reconciliation. I've seen it in my own, family and household. I'm in a mixed race household, marriage with kids, and I think this idea that we are fundamentally separated by race is is ridiculous. Anyone that is in a kind of biracial marriage or relationship or has kids, I mean, it couldn't be further from the truth. There's something that is deeply human that, despite those racial differences or disparities or discrimination, that I think we can aspire to. And one statistic that I thought was kind of surprising, and I think is good, maybe the dismay of both critical race theorists and white supremacists, is that interracial marriages have gone up 1,000% since 1970. I think this is good. I think this is a kind of wholly American thing, and gives me at least some kind of cause for optimism.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that interracial marriage thing, when I was I'm 50. When I was a kid, it was really weird to see a black lady and a white dude on the Jeffersons. But
Yeah.
it's in no way weird now. And to see a couple that is mixed in some way, like Hispanic and white or whatever it is, it doesn't even, you don't even notice it. Like, it's so normal. It's incredible how diverse and how intermingled we really are here in the US if we allow ourselves to be. You know, like, and Bob is great. He talks about race mongers. And the moment you bring race into a hard problem, the logic leaves. There's no room for it.
Yeah.
It just sucks everything in. It's like this shitty singularity. And it makes it so that you can't solve problems. You know, like assigning me whiteness without even, I don't know. I've never swabbed my cheek and said, what am I?
You got to swab.
Right. And then you could say, well, you're Caucasian. If I was to go to Armenia, would they welcome me? Like, oh, you're home. You know, no, that's not real. And I do put the cock in Caucasian. I like to say that too. But
all right.
Random, but okay.
Well, it's just fun. It's part of my, gotta tell some jokes, Will.
The other like funny thing too, like just a personal anecdote, and I don't know if is representative, but you know, when my family goes around in the in the US, like, we never get comments or dirty looks or any kind of weird vibe. I almost never think about it, right? But we went to Vienna, Austria last summer or 2 summers ago, and we got, I mean, horrific looks, like really dirty looks, and people were, you know. And I realized, oh wow, this is like an experience I've never had, and it was so strange because you think of Europeans as kind of the enlightened and Americans as backwards, but our experience with these issues, even the conflict with these issues that we've had, gives us a perspective that most European countries don't have, and just an interesting thing. And even in my village, you know, like my uncle actually has a Filipino wife. But when he brought the Filipino wife to the village the first time, it was, I mean, oof, like people wanted to be nice, but they didn't know what to do. It was very awkward for everyone involved. So I think too, we downplay our own strengths as a country, as a culture, in our own capacity to kind of to deal with this stuff.
Yeah, I think you're right. Our history. One thing, real quick, Will, that our history, like you said, a lot of folks are still alive from a time that was much more challenging racially. Jackie Robinson's wife, Rachel, she's still alive, and I bet if you had a candid conversation with her and said, "Is it better or worse now?" she would unequivocally say, "Oh God, it's way." I mean, they couldn't get on a goddamn airplane, you know. Wow. So it's got to be way better, and we can't lose sight of that. We have a system that allows this constant improvement of what we are as a society. Sorry, Will, I didn't mean to step on you.
No, that's fine. I mean, I did the first like 20 minutes talking early on the show, but I mean, no, I don't think any of us is an especially sensitive guy of the three. But at any rate, this ties into what probably really is my last question, which is, I mean, empirically in my field, like what you're saying, Chris, isn't really all that disputed. Everyone recognizes racism, of course. But if you look at, there's what's called the work for, vote for question. For example, you ask people, would you be comfortable with a boss who was a member of a different race? Would you vote for a qualified black candidate for your political party? Or would you be comfortable with your sales director being African American? And the answers to that question used to be well over 50% for whites. By the way, they used to be well over 20, 30% for African Americans on some variations. Like, no, I want a black boss. I want black teammates. The last time I looked with Pew Research, the answer to that was around 6, 8% for everybody. So there seems to be this group of maybe 6 or 7% of people who are actual bigots. Sounds about right. But I mean, the question is, as we move toward a society where 1 marriage in 4 is interracial, why are we now seeing the backlash that you're now competing against academically? The idea that racism is everywhere, white supremacy is everywhere. This is something I'm genuinely curious about because I don't research it. Why is there such anger among the upper class now? Is this sort of an excuse for upper class failure, insecurity, or what's the reason, in your opinion?
It's a great question. There's a great set of charts. I think it's Zach Goldberg on Twitter who put out these charts. He did a New York Times word search for all of the kind of trendy social justice slogans, systemic racism, blah, 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 all the things. And it's like steady. And then in like 2013, 2014, it starts to grow up, and then it's just boom. It's just like the tulip bulb or mania or whatever. And it's really odd. I don't know. It's a question I've kind of grappled with, but haven't really developed a satisfactory answer yet. But it appears that this kind of mania, in my view, it begins towards the end of the Obama presidency, which is very counterintuitive. And then accelerates through Trump, which I get. I mean, Trump, they use it as kind of a political ploy, a kind of political dichotomy, a political binary, and then has just been going up ever since. But the seeds of this stuff were laid in the 1990s, well, really in the 1960s, and then in the 90s in academia. So it's very strange. Critical theory and critical race theory is kind of laid dormant almost in the kind of academic world. But then around 2013, 2014, 2015, jumped into the mainstream, jumped into the New York Times, jumped into Twitter. So I don't know. There's a couple hypotheses. Maybe it's social media that perpetuates the kind of hardest left narratives. Maybe it's a kind of disillusionment with the kind of from the euphoria of Obama to 2008 to the kind of disillusionment by the mid part of his second term, perhaps. Perhaps it's accelerated because of Trump, because it's an effective political weapon. But I suspect there's a kind of deeper truth there. And I suspect that there's something in kind of elite, kind of academic, journalistic, and kind of life where this kind of meme, once it was introduced, was unstoppable and grew at a kind of exponential rate. I don't know. That's a great question. I'm not sure I have a good answer for it.
Yeah, it's an interesting one.
Yeah.
I mean, one
What do you think?
hypothesis-
What do you think, Will?
Yeah. That's what I think we both started to respond, actually. I mean, so my hypothesis would be, this ties into what you said earlier about woke capital, and this is something I've actually written a few short essays about. I think that modern wokeness gives members of the upper class, the lower upper class, especially white members, a chance to kind of expunge that guilt that they feel about being born into plush suburbs and so on, wealthy fathers, the things that lead to a lot of the tensions in business life, even dating life, without actually having to change or give up their position. I think that's a somewhat cynical way of looking at it. A less cynical way of looking at it would be that if you are to the manor born, like if you go from, Groton to Yale, or maybe the top of the Big Ten if you're slumming, and then you go to a publishing house in DC or New York, maybe Chicago if you're slumming, the people that are around you will all be rich. They'll almost all be good looking and fit in conventional terms. They'll mostly be coastal, so on, so on, so on. But you will see differences of race and of sexual orientation. So the very slight amount of bigotry your friends in those categories see will be remarkable to you because the rest of the well-off, stable group doesn't see any. You're not going to see a lot of lower class people unless you go to a restaurant. So you can debate whether it's intentional or not, but I think that's kind of what it is. This is a way to expunge guilt without having to do anything yourself. If you were actually to ask some of these people, why don't you give your job or your next available internship to a black dude from the hood or a white dude from a trailer park, a Native American Indian? The odds of any of them doing it would be flat zero. So I think this plays into that.
Yeah, I think you might be right. And maybe there is to a certain extent to the left, kind of the gentry left, right? Those kind of radical chic from Tom Wolfe's days, they're always kind of seeking the new revolution. And maybe this kind of race-based revolution is more palatable to folks that again don't have to grapple with the much more difficult issues of class. And maybe it's a kind of neo-mania, a kind of obsession for the new. And this is just merely a kind of waypoint on the general trajectory of the left. And I think too, you're right. It requires, the great thing about, you know, let me rephrase that. The kind of useful thing about systemic racism is that it absolves kind of woke elites from any kind of change in behavior, like you're saying, right? And I think it's very convenient because you can say, oh, this is the big bad thing, I'm against it, but you don't actually have to do anything. I mean, you don't have to go anywhere or do anything or fight for anyone. You're fighting against a kind of abstract enemy, where it's really kind of just voicing opposition is a reward in itself. And so I think it's so strange. I don't know. I don't know. I might be wrong, but it seems like it's from a kind of racial perspective that we've made tremendous progress over the last 150 years. That's indisputable. And it seems like such a lost opportunity to not say, what have we done right? How can we build on progress moving forward? It really feels like we're tearing ourselves apart. And it's dispiriting. It's kind of sad to watch it all unfold.
I suppose I would add this little bit to the end of all of that, because I like to try to have my final note be a positive one. We're actually in pretty good shape overall. You know, the folks that try to do these things, theory connects to ground truth so infrequently that they can blather on, and we're all so impressionable that media will yank us left or right or up or down. And you know, next thing you know, we're going to care about immigration again. Although we really don't care. It's just like when there were the human atrocities going on in Syria. Oh, we were desperate to solve it. But no one was fucking grabbing their backpack and getting on an airplane and going to work. So these things, look, they flap around in the wind and it gets all crazy. But I think if you really want to make a difference in someone's life, go find someone and help them. And don't tell them what help you're going to give them. Say, hey, what kind of help can I give you? If you're a homeless person, what do you need right now? Can I buy you a bag of 10 burritos? Hell yeah. No, I'd like to have some cash so I can buy some crack. Fine, here you go. Go do what you got to do, because it's not my job to get them off of crack. So I think you could go literally and put your ass to work. You work 40 hours a month on helping someone from within their paradigm of what is helpful. You'll make way more difference than anybody in any university ever could at helping people. All right.
Fair enough.
Absolutely.
I guess that's it. Hey, I love it. I love when we get to have these conversations. I love adding rigor and taking on these challenging topics. I had Matt Brainerd on yesterday talking about election stuff, and he's like, "There's cool. Black and white data," you know, and I love it. It's uncomfortable, man. But these are truths we have to deal with. What were you going to say?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've seen some of his stuff. I haven't followed it lately. I'll have to go back into your archive and check it out. Yeah, that's a totally different deal. Yeah,
totally different. But these are the kind of conversations, and Will brings great topics where my friends are like, "You're crazy to have this conversation." And I'm like, then that's exactly what I want to do, because we're not going to figure this out by not having a conversation.
Yeah, people are so scared. I think people are so fearful, and I've got it. I've been on the back, kind of the ugly side of the mob, and it's very hard, but I think it's great. You have to have the conversation. People should be much more free to express themselves. And I think that we should venture out even into the controversial, because if we all keep only within the confines of conventionality, we're not going to make any progress. And I think you can even be wrong. It's like, why can't people be wrong anymore? People, like, if someone sees that you're wrong on social media or whatever, I mean, people are just brutal. They just want to like rip you apart. And it's like, okay, I was wrong. Big deal, you know?
Yeah.
So I'm glad that it's a good forum for that.
Well, thanks, man. Let me sign off here. Stand by, everybody.
All right.